webinar on assessing the socio-economic impacts of offshore wind farms. My name is Robin Cox and I oversee the scientific research programme of the European Offshore Wind Deployment Centre, the EOWDC. And this socio-economic research project carried out by Oxford Brookes is the first of the 6 projects commissioned under the EOWDC research programme to be completed. And I'm delighted that Professor John Glasson and Dr. Bridget Durning of Oxford Brookes are able to host this webinar this morning to present their findings. We would, of course, like to have this to have been a physical meeting in Aberdeen, but given the current circumstances, we felt it was important to be able to present the findings of the research to this audience now, rather than waiting for an indefinite period for a physical meeting to be possible. Well, we do still hope to host a physical meeting in March next year, and I'll keep you all updated on that. And I'll also update you all in the next month on the progress of the other 5 research projects. So before I hand over to John and Bridget, a quick word on how the webinar will work. I understand you're all currently muted, so if you have a question or comment, please use the chat function, which Bridget will be monitoring during the presentation, and then there'll be a Q&A session at the end of the presentation. So that's it for me. So over to you, John and Bridget.
Okay, so I'll start sharing my screen to show John's slides.
Yep.
This is where the practice fails to work properly. There we go.
That's great.
Okay.
Thanks very much, Bridget. Well, thank you all for joining in this webinar this morning. It's very important we get some feedback on this work. First of all, I'd just like to acknowledge the support of Vattenfall. It's been wonderful having their support for this research. I also want to acknowledge people who've already reviewed this, and I note one of the attendees is Doug Borthwick. Thank you, Doug. You gave some very useful feedback on our guidance documents, and I think it's been improved because of your comments. Okay, there are quite a few slides here with quite a lot of material, and I'm going to go through them reasonably fast. I'll only be pulling out certain aspects of each slide, but they will be made available to you at the end if you wish to follow up on some of the details which I haven't covered. Next slide, please, Bridget.
When the system stops working. It worked fine in practice, didn't it? There we go.
No, that's fine. As Robin said, this has been carried out by a team at Oxford Brookes University. It's the Impact Assessment Research Unit, which has got a long history in doing research like this. We have a team of 4 people, and 2 of us are here today, myself and Bridget. Next slide, please. Structure of the presentation, there are 6 sections set out there. What is the purpose of this research, and how did we underpin it? The dynamic offshore wind farm renewable energy industry, I think, needs some setting in context. And then we go into how you engage with the planning and assessment process, and then in detail looking at economic issues, and then social issues, and then some conclusions. Next slide, please. Oh, firstly, the aims and the underpinning research. Next slide. Our focus is on socio-economic impacts. But until recently, these have been seen as a poor relation in impact assessment, but that is changing. And in particular, this concept of social license to operate has become popular. And this is consideration by developers that they need to work with communities. If they don't, life may become difficult. And there's quite a lot of international drivers pressured for this, and you can see some of the drivers there. Another driver for this research is, of course, offshore wind is becoming very, very important in our energy mix, and we are moving on from onshore to offshore. Next slide, please. But also important, and a key feature of this research is what does it do for deprived local and regional communities. Many coastal communities in the UK have been suffering from a decline of traditional industries, shipbuilding, fishing, tourism, iron and steel, etc. Does this industry provide a socio-economic opportunity? This is something we are exploring. Well, there's a lack of knowledge, and one of the purposes of this research was to provide some improved knowledge for key stakeholders, for developers, for local governments, national governments, development agencies, and the general public, and they are the audience for this report. So we're trying to assemble a set of practice guidance for stakeholders on this under-assessed area. Next slide, please. Our findings are based on 6 pieces of research. One, a literature review, which includes the industry publications and the academic publications. Secondly, a review of environmental statements. What do they say about socioeconomic impacts? We reviewed 25 environmental statements of recent UK offshore wind farms, and 13 from other countries, predominantly the Netherlands, Denmark, and Belgium. Next slide, please. We had a major case study of the Aberdeen offshore wind farm. This is the Vattenfall project and the driver behind the research. And we rolled into that to consideration of 2 floating wind farms, the High Wind and Kincardine floating wind farms, which are just offshore, up the Aberdeen shore. But this is a relatively small wind farm, the Aberdeen one, and the floating ones are even smaller. So we wanted to build in some large comparators. Next slide, please. And we took another Scottish offshore wind farm, the Beatrice one, up off the northeast coast, a much larger one, about 6 times larger than the Aberdeen one. And then on a super scale, we took the Hornsea offshore array, 4 major wind farms here. One is already operational, one is well under construction, and 2 others. I should express an interest here because I was examining inspector for 2 of these. So I got quite an insight into Hornsea 1 and Hornsea 2. Next slide, please. Let's move on to the offshore wind farm industry itself. Next slide, please. It's a rapidly growing industry, and the UK is in a dominant position in this. You can see that end of 2019, the cumulative capacity was 22 gigawatts, of which 40% roughly was in the UK, 10 gigawatts, 40 major wind farms, well over 2,000 turbines connected. Next slide, please. It's interesting to see the distribution in Europe, actually. It is limited substantially to a few countries. Surprising that France doesn't have much, although France, I think, will catch up. The diagram at the side showing the flags shows that we have been leading in terms of connected output. Germany second, but note the third flag there, which is China, and they will be shooting ahead very soon with their offshore wind farm capacity. Next slide, please. A few macroeconomic features about our offshore wind farm industry. It's going to grow fast. The plan is up to 40 gigawatts in 10 years' time, involving up to 50 billion infrastructure. It's a major growth industry. That's partly assisted by a rapid fall in unit cost. The contract for difference price has fallen over £100 and will be about £40 per megawatt for some immediate new ones. Renewables in total, dominated by wind, are beginning to outstrip fossil fuels for the first time since the 19th century. And many jobs associated with this could be up to about 30,000 jobs by 2030. Yet, despite all that success, there is serious concern that a lot of the economic benefits of this development are just leaking out of the country. And the Scottish Energy Minister, Paul Wheelhouse, commented about 9 months ago now that while Scotland is this ideal location for offshore wind, recent projects haven't delivered the significant economic opportunities we want to see. There's a lot of leaking out of the Scottish economy, and there is a great deal of concern to do something about this. Next slide, please. So let's get into the planning and assessment procedures. What procedures will developers and other stakeholders go through in planning and assessing offshore wind? Next slide, please. Major offshore wind farms, and they are major nowadays, require environmental impact statements leading to an environmental statement, and EIA regulations are worldwide. They apply to almost 200 countries worldwide. We have an EIA procedure under the European directive, and that was last amended in 2014, and a few innovations were introduced, widening the content, so more socio-economic, as well as all the biophysical that was there to begin with, and building in post-consent monitoring, which I think is very important. I'll come back to that several times during the presentation. What does the typical EIA involve? Well, those are the steps there. I'm sure you're all familiar with those. You look at the environment, you look at the project, you put the two together and what are the issues, how are they going to develop over time, how significant are they, mitigate the adverse, enhance the positive, and monitor the impacts and learn from experience. And that last dot is the weak link in a lot of this. We need to learn from experience. And that's one of the aims of this project. Next slide, please. There are specific offshore wind farm procedures in different regimes. In Scotland, it's a dual system where for the projects offshore, they're administered under the Electricity Works Act, onshore under Town and Country Planning. In England, they're NSIPs, National Significant Infrastructure Projects, handled under that regime, examined by the Planning Inspectorate, and decisions made by the Secretary of State. Next slide, please. So what are socioeconomic impacts? What do they include? How important are they? On the left-hand side, they're divided into economic, jobs, supply chain, multiplier effects, impacts on particular industries like fishing, and social, impacts on local population, local services, lifestyle, cohesion, stress, who gains, who loses, the distributional effects. Now, a lot of people would say for offshore wind farms, these are not important. These are stuck out in the sea, out of sight, out of mind. Why look at socioeconomic impacts? But these projects do come ashore. And there are also long-term operation and maintenance aspects to these projects, which are based in coastal communities. We did a review of 25 environmental statements, and we found they all had UK environmental statements. They all had socioeconomic sections, some very substantial, some less so. I've already mentioned the driver of the social license to operate. But when you're looking at coastal communities, it's the local content that's important. What can these projects do for local areas and regional areas? Next slide, please. So what methods are available for economic impact and for social impact? Well, firstly, economic impact. And what I'm going to do is go through the steps involved in an environmental assessment through baseline studies, scoping the issues, prediction, which is really the black box in all this, mitigation and monitoring. Next slide, please. The first thing you need to do is to understand the life cycle of the offshore wind farm, understand the project. And I just refer you to the right-hand side, the right-hand column of this diagram. This gives you some estimates of the costs involved for a 1 gigawatt offshore wind farm development for the various stages of the project. This draws on work done by BVG consultants who have done a lot of very useful work on offshore wind, plus some of our work drawing on environmental statements. There are 4 main stages. The development stage, estimated cost by 120 million for the development aspects of a major wind farm. 8 million for the environmental statement, of which 350,000 roughly for socio-economic assessment. But the big stage is capital expenditure, the CapEx stage, roughly 2 to 3 billion per gigawatt. Although efficiencies are coming in, and this is roughly a 3-year stage for a wind farm of that size. And then the operational stage. This sometimes gets overlooked, but it's very significant. About £75 million of expenditure per annum, and there are 20 to 25 years of these per annums. That comes to about 1.5 billion. That is substantial for a community. And then decommissioning. So altogether, you're getting estimated impact of about 4 to 5 billion, probably undiscounted, over the project life, and quite a lot of that is coming ashore. Next slide, please. But how much is actually staying in the adjacent country? There have been a lot of studies of UK content. This was 2017 UK renewables. They've updated this a little bit now. But you can see that the development stage, about 73% of content staying in the UK. The capital construction stage, only about 30%. The operational stage, about 3/4, 75%. In total, maybe about half staying within the UK. But that's the UK. We're talking about local and regional communities. And there's quite a lot of leakage out of that. Excuse me a minute, I've just lost my screen. Okay, sorry about that. Next slide, please. When you're looking at socio-economic impacts, and especially economic impacts, you must also be aware of the interlinkages, the sort of various components. You have direct impact of building the development. That has indirect impacts, the supply chain, you can see that, the parts and tools. And then there's the induced impact. The people who are working in the direct and indirect are spending money locally and having an induced impact. And there's also this aspect of catalytic effects, that these developments can advance the technology, they can enhance skills, and they have an overall positive impact in deprived areas. I'll come back to that later with regard to Humberside and Hull. Next slide, please. So firstly, you understand the project. Secondly, you understand the local economic baseline. This is an interesting one in offshore wind farms. So what is the local economy? For the Beatrice project, they took coastal areas down the Moray Firth, Highlands and Aberdeenshire. For Aberdeen, they had an inner area, the city and shire, and an outer area, Scotland. I think our view is there is merit in differentiating between local area about 60-minute catchment, and a wider regional context, maybe Scotland for Scottish projects for the construction stage. But when you get into the O&M stage, the local area is a much narrower area because people are there working on the project for 20, 25 years. They tend to come closer to the project and live in a much tighter area. Next slide, please. How do you look at the local economy? Well, there are all kinds of indicators of economic prosperity, some of them there for Humberside. And you can see that Hull is quite depressed economically. If you compare the Hull column with the UK comparator, percentage working age population is less than the UK. Population with no qualifications is much higher than the UK. Here you've got a problem coastal community, and you need to identify the nature of the local economy. Next slide, please. So scoping, when you put the two together, the project and the local area, you begin to identify some of the key issues. And in most environmental statements, it's the economic key issues which dominate the social, about 5 to 1 in terms of content in these documents. Scoping good practice should recognise impacts across the life cycle. It's not just the construction stage, it's the operational and management stage as well. They should try and address who wins, who loses from these projects. And there is some guidance to follow. For example, in England, the English National Policy Statement for Energy advises you to look at the workforce life cycle, jobs, training, effects on tourism. Next slide, please. So what are the impacts? This is beginning to open the black box. You can see in that little table there, you should be looking at economic impacts across all the stages. You should be looking at the direct, indirect, and induced in terms of people and in terms of gross value added. And there's a multiplier factor involved here. For every one item, one job, one item of GVA, you've got a multiplier involved, and it's of the order of 1.75 to 2, roughly. Next stage, please. But this is an area of great uncertainty. Mr. Rumsfeld has a nice quote here, and there are lots of unknowns or claimed unknowns by developers with regard to socio-economic impacts. We don't know where the port's going to be, although I would argue with more and more developments in the North Sea especially, the port locations are becoming clearer. For example, Ørsted, major developer, seems to be fixing on Grimsby. We don't know what the supply chain capacity is going to be. I think that's a fair point to some extent, but again, we're learning more about the Humberside area, the Aberdeen area, Great Yarmouth and Lowestoft economies. And this rapidly evolving technology, I think this is an interesting unknown with the turbines getting more and more powerful, new technology coming in. I mean, for the O&M stage, maybe drones could replace people, and what's the implication of that? And new technologies such as floating offshore wind farms. Down the right-hand side, there is some advice that assumptions should be made clear, probability ranges attached if at all possible, and an uncertainty report can be used to bring together some of this uncertainty. Next slide, please. Almost all predictions involve scenarios, and they tend to have low, medium, high for local, regional, national areas. And this can be very frustrating at times because the range of scenarios is so wide. For example, for Beatrice, for the construction stage, the employment scenarios varied from 400 in the low scenario to 1800 in the high scenario for the construction stage. I think over time, we will be shifting more to some of the medium scenarios for onshore construction. and high scenarios for the O&M stage. For offshore, medium scenarios, I think, are becoming more likely. And the examinations I've been involved in the UK, the developers have tended during the examination to move towards the medium scenario. But what is low, medium, high? There are all kinds of variations. You can see some of the variations between three wind farms there. Brighton Knoll, high is 100% UK sourcing, whereas East Anglia, high is 55% UK sourcing. Still a lot of variation around in these scenarios. Next slide, please. So how do you predict? Well, there are very simple methods and there are more complex methods. The more complex methods tend to use input-output analysis using the UK Treasury Green Book, various input-output tables, for example, the Scottish Government input-output tables. But input-output tables are only as good as the material you put in. And there is some skepticism about input-output tables and a suggestion that simpler methods might have certain advantages. Next slide, please. I draw your attention to the BVG Associates University of the Highlands and Islands document. I think this is a very interesting little document. It's only 4 pages long, and it starts off by saying, it's better to seek to understand the supply chain than to model it using misleading generalized data. And I think that's a hint at input-output analysis. They have a very interesting, simple method, and I would advise you to have a look at their 4-page document, actually. I think it's quite a neat way of predicting impacts without getting into great complications and using generalized input-output data indicators. Next slide, please. We looked at a lot of environmental statements and we came out with some rules of thumb from their predictions. I mean, take these or leave them, but I think they give you an indication of what you might get for certain developments. For example, the middle dot there, for the O&M stage, the annual full-time equivalent per megawatt over the 20-25 year life of the project is of the order of 0.15 to 0.02 person per megawatt for a region. This gives you a rule of thumb, and the same for construction, although there's more variation there. Multipliers, I've said the mean multiplier is 1 to 1, which is a multiplier of 2. We include these figures in our report, and they show a point in time, actually. They will obviously change over time, but they give you an indication of what you might get for certain megawatt sizes of offshore wind farms. Next one, please. I'll just jump quickly over this. There's been very little actual measurement of local economic impacts. So this is one done for the Robin Rigg offshore wind farm, which just shows the high level of leakage out from this project. But it's an interesting study, and commend that one to have a look at. Next slide, please. The next step is what do you do about these impacts? How do you mitigate the negative and enhance the positive? And socio-economic is really all about enhancing the positive. And that's working with the supply chain, working with training. But it's also about building in requirements for the developers. And when I was examining Hornsea 1 and Hornsea 2, we built in an employment and skills requirement into the permission. Under the English system, the DCO is the planning permission. And we built in a requirement 17, that no part of the authorised development may be commenced until an employment and skills plan has been submitted to and approved by the local authorities. And that is becoming standard now, certainly in English offshore wind farm developments. Next slide, please. And finally, monitoring, the weak link in impact assessment. Monitoring can help you check on compliance. You can check on predictions. You can manage the project better. And you learn from one project to the next. It's a learning factor. But it's been very weak until recently. But you can see for the Scottish wind farm there, Neart, that monitoring is going to be built in to that project, hopefully. That would be an interesting one to check on, actually. Next slide, please. Our work includes some monitoring case studies, and Aberdeen, Beatrice, and the Hornsey one. I'll just briefly mention the Aberdeen one because that's the main study. And what it basically showed was the predictions for construction impact for local and regional benefit was overestimated, but for the operation and management stage, it was underestimated. And some of the figures are there, and I won't go into them in detail. They're in the report, and I believe you've all got copies of the report. Next slide, please. The Beatrice project, again, I think there was some overestimate of the construction benefits, and again, underestimate of the O&M. The Hornsey project is an interesting one because it shows the benefit of a hub development. There are a lot of projects developed off Humberside, and they're coming ashore basically in Grimsby and Hull area. And when you add all these projects together, the second dot down there, they're generating on average 2,000 to 2,500 jobs per annum from construction, and 1,000 jobs per annum from the O&M side. And they're beginning to pull in development and supply chain activities like the Siemens Blade Factory and the Able Marine Park. Next slide, please. Right, let's move on to social. Again, going through the key steps. Next slide, please. Firstly, what is the community? Understanding the community. And getting involved in more qualitative, softer issues, such as attitudes to changing seascape. What does it mean for the marine environment? But what is local? There are a number of locals here. There's the community of place, the areas affected by the wind farm. This can be very specific hotspots. Near the Aberdeen wind farm, there was a community known as Black Dog, where the cable came ashore and the substation is based, and that had major impact. But then there is the coastal area of Aberdeen. The offshore wind farm is only 2 kilometres off the coast and can be seen very clearly from Aberdeen. But in addition to that, there's a wider community of interest who are interested in renewable energy, but it may also be tourism visitors to an area and interested in the impact on the coast. So you need to understand the various communities, and information can be gleaned from local authorities, parish councils, community councils, and you can draw up a baseline based on those contacts. Next slide, please. Views about offshore wind farms can be quite polarized. This is a 10 years ago study now, but the arguments primarily raised against offshore wind farms are the aesthetic impact on the landscape, if you can see them. If they're further offshore, that's less of an issue. The arguments primarily in support are that this is a clean, renewable energy, and that tends to generate a lot of goodwill. Next slide, please. So what are the issues? From our review of environmental statements, there was a very limited scoping in of social impact issues. Some talked about community vitality, viability from the construction stage, and associated positive aspects associated with jobs as well. But overall, there was a general assumption that social impacts are not all that important. However, whatever the distance from the shore, projects come ashore. They generate jobs. They may have impacts on housing if workers move in for substation construction, or they move in for the offshore construction as well. And then there's the important O&M stage. Some of the issues are noted there. Next slide, please. There's been research undertaken on social issues, for example, by Hatton for the Crown Estate, and they adopt this capital stock approach, and they find positive findings in terms of skills impact, the jobs impact I just mentioned, maybe some impacts unclear in terms of upsetting people's link with seascape. Social capital impacts, mixed. It's seen as good for environmental impact, some jobs, but some concerns about how will it affect the wildlife and property. Impact unclear on tourism. We're going to do more work on that. But I think the experience in a lot of places is the tourism impact is not particularly negative, and there may be some positive opportunities there. Next slide, please. But what is very important in terms of social impact is community engagement. Work with the communities. This is the social license to operate approach. And we identify an 8-part plan which seemed to work very well for the Aberdeen project, at least. Appoint a community liaison officer. There was a very positive community liaison officer for this project, and she did a great job. Work with the community early. Engage on a regular basis through all the project stages. Use opportunities provided by community groups like parochial councils. Provide some pub priming support for activities. For example, Aberdeen, there was some funding for the football club actually, and there was funding for all kinds of local initiatives and newsletters, etc. Local community groups. Survey community views on a regular basis through the life cycle, and monitor the media. The media can provide an interesting insight into how the community is seeing the project. And produce publicly available monitoring reports. On other major projects we've been working on, we've been recommending a website for the project, and an easily available website which anyone can use, and I think that's important. Next slide, please. These are some of the community views during the stages. The construction stage first. Not experienced came up very strongly, or as expected. It's the 2 columns in the middle which are the particularly interesting ones, I think. Visual impacts, less than expected. But also employment impacts, less than expected. Next slide, please. We carried out this through the life cycle into the O&M stage. Very similar, although the one emboldened there, the visual impacts of offshore turbines, more than expected. I think that was one of the surprises for local communities. But even so, I think the community was quite positive overall, and a lot of people quite liked the look of these, and they are becoming a bit of a tourist attraction. Next slide, please. Media is interesting. We did a survey of the media, local press, and the social media to see what was coming up, and we divided them into negative themes and positive themes across the stages of the life cycle. And the larger the circle, the bigger the issue. And you see in pre-approval public consultation, golf tourism comes up very strongly. And I'm sure many of you know what this is. This is the Trump golf course, and there was a lot of objection to the development from people interested in golf, although it seemed to be quite a well-organized campaign from the golfers there. Various other issues coming up, but you can see over time the issues tend to fade away, and by the time we get into operational stage, the negative themes are pretty light, actually. Next slide, please. Whereas the positive themes, renewable energy, job creation, economic development, offsetting the decline in the oil industry in Aberdeen, maintained their significance. Next slide, please. So what's next? How would you enhance social impacts? An example from Humberside here, where they've worked very closely with education providers to facilitate local people getting jobs in the industry. So the University of Hull has got a master's program. Hull College has got a digital and green energy centre. Money has gone in at all levels of education in the area. And it's interesting, the argument is that the offshore wind farm industry has raised confidence and aspiration in this area. One reflection might be that Hull's success in winning the competition to be UK City of Culture. And there is more of a buzz about this area now, and that's partly associated with the offshore wind farm industry, where there is a major hub here in Humberside. Next slide, please. And then there are community benefit funds. Almost all offshore wind farms now have a community benefit fund. And the Aberdeen one is a very interesting and good example of this. Building on public consultation and some advice from the Scottish Government Good Practice Document 2015. The fund was established last year. It's £150,000 a year over 20 years, 3 million in total. That's 1,500 per megawatt per annum. It's for the whole of Aberdeen City and Shire, but with 10% sliced off for the Black Dog area. It's managed by an independent panel, and they've had the first round of applications. One worry was that there were no applications for the local community, and this may be due to the lack of residents' association, and it was seen as a complex process, I think. Next slide, please. Similar funds for Beatrice and Hornsey. Beatrice, a bigger fund, but per megawatt, only a third the size of the Aberdeen fund, and the Hornsey fund is even less. When you compare these with onshore wind farms, these are quite small, actually, in terms of per megawatt funding. The Beatrice one was interesting in that research was done on what the multiplier impact was of these funds using a social return on investment approach. And the estimate was that for every £1 spent on the community benefit fund, there was another £3 roughly generated in wider value in the community. Next slide, please. Just some good practice lessons on community benefit. The more open and consultative you are, engaging people, working with them on which areas should receive the funding, the better. The two-tier approach seems to work well. Independent decision boards work well. The use of a wider social return on investment approach is an interesting one to assess the wider impacts of these funds. Next slide, please. So briefly, some conclusions. Next slide, please. Just half a dozen key findings here. It's important to understand the life cycle of these projects. Socio-economic impacts vary across the life cycle, especially across the two main stages, construction and operation and maintenance. There's a predominance of economic impacts to date in assessments. I think the social impacts are being underplayed to some extent. Offshore wind farm developments can make important contributions to local communities, especially the O&M stage. Local content is important and needs to be enhanced if at all possible. But there is still major local economic leakage, especially from the construction stage. If you can achieve scale and hub status, then more benefits flow. You get economies of scale, you get suppliers moving in, and you get more and more benefits from the main stages in the life cycle. Next slide, please. And finally, just some key recommendations. Socioeconomic impacts are important, even if projects are distant from the shore, and a lot of them now are. From experience, it's sometimes hard to find these impacts in environmental statements. My apologies, I've lost you again. Sorry about that. My system keeps cutting out here. So if the environmental statement can pull together socioeconomics in one chapter, that would be very helpful. Try to pin down the investment, expenditure and employment plans for the project life cycle. Try to minimize uncertainty, avoiding these wide ranges of low, medium and high impacts. I think there is some narrowing down now of these. Build in an employment and skills plan or equivalent as a condition in socioeconomic undertakings, so that there is a commitment to carry out these various plans for local benefit. Commit to early and continuing community engagement. Use a community liaison officer, use community benefits agreements, and monitor the actual impacts so that we actually learn from experience. And on this final point, I just want to say, we have so many developments taking place in the North Sea now. There are advantages in monitoring. I mean, these could be done by a single developer. I mean, Ørsted has got a lot of developments there. SSE has, they could monitor several projects because there is a cumulative impact here. But in a way, this monitoring would be better done at a government level. And I know we have Scottish government people listening to this. I think it would be a very interesting project for, say, the Scottish government to monitor the cumulative socioeconomic impacts on various communities around the Scottish coast. It would be a nice project and it would give you some very useful information. Thank you. Final slide. Thank you very much. Thank you for putting up with all that detail and for me going on for about 40 minutes. Over to you now. Questions, please, which go via Bridget.
Okay, let me just okay, how to get back into my screen now. No screen sharing, stop screen sharing. There we go. Hello. Okay. Okay, so Robin, were you monitoring? Was there any questions on the chat? There's one here that I can see.
I wasn't monitoring, no, so if you can see that, then just go ahead.
Okay, this is from Renate. Do you want to unmute and ask your question? If not, I can ask it for you. Don't know if that person, no, they may have gone. Okay. The question was do you see, will you be advising increasing local content requirements, in particular for the CapEx phase? And are things likely to change once the UK leaves the EU?
I mean, I don't think you can ask for certain levels of local content, but we should certainly be encouraging them through things like employment and skills plans. I mean, I think if you have these conditions attached to the permission, that developers must work with local authorities to establish a skills program and give preference to local providers wherever possible under EU rules. Those sort of things we should be encouraging. And we, as I said, we should be encouraging developers to be pushing for medium impact scenarios. And I think there's no reason why we shouldn't be moving towards those now. As we get hubs developed on shore. I mean, for example, Grimsby is the major hub for Ørsted now around Humberside. And we know these projects are going to come ashore there now. So we can expect developments in that area. With regard to leaving the EU, it's hard to say. I mean, you and I, Bridget, and many others involved in environmental assessment are hoping that England stays committed to environmental assessment under the EIA directive. I'm sure Scotland will. Well, I think so. I mean, people from Scotland might like to comment on that. I think in many ways, this is in the developer's interest, actually. It goes back to the social license to operate. If you want to work in harmony with communities, local content is important and is seen as important. And you saw in the Aberdeen project, I think there was a little bit of disappointment that not enough jobs were perceived as coming, although more may be actually happening than are being perceived by the local community through the O&M stage. I think for harmonious developer-community relations, building up local content is important.
Okay, good. Okay, so we have Stuart
Bridget,
Gibb.
you jump in as well. You've been involved in this project.
Stuart Gibb has a question, if you'd like to mute.
Yes, Stuart.
Hi, folks. So my name is Stuart Gibb. I chaired the scientific panel of the EOWDC for a number of years, including the multi-criteria decision analysis system that we designed and used to identify and fund projects. And that allowed us to focus on the key issues. And I think that was at that point that you raised, John. I really enjoyed the presentation. Particularly the reflections on the socio-economic benefits projection and those that were realised, media tracking diagrams and the recommendations. But the question is around one of this criteria in the selection process, and it was which projects were designed to have wider benefits to the sector. And I think you identified that we needed to learn from experience here. So it's a fairly general question. What are the next stages ensuring that all this work that's been done is communicated or translated to the sector more generally to make sure that we don't go over this ground again and the best value is achieved from this work?
Yes, thank you. It's a good question. I think if you look at the last few pages of our report, we set out some dissemination steps, of which this is the first one. The documents and all our technical reports are going to be publicly available. I'm glad Vattenfall has been quite generous in pushing this out to the wider community. I know that the Scottish Government is doing research on this. They're seeing this as an important topic, and I've been in touch with Kay Barclay and Kathleen Allen from the Scottish Government. They're both listening into this. And they might like to comment actually as to how they see this going forward and the extent to which they see socioeconomics as important. Because I think what's behind your comment is that this is still seen as a small area compared with birds and dolphins and things like that. But it is an important area because these are people's livelihoods. And there are opportunities here. Opportunities for communities that have been badly hit over 50 to 100 years by things not going very well. So I think it's an opportunity we've got to take, and we've got to build up local content. And I know Paul Wheelhouse, your minister, is very keen on getting more local benefit for Scotland. But I wonder whether we could pass this to Kay and Kathleen and whether they want to add anything from Scottish Government perspective.
Hello, yes, hi. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yep, hi Kay.
Oh good, sorry, I'm on my phone, so it's really difficult to operate Zoom, so thank you. Yeah, I'll go first and then Kathleen may want to comment as well, but thanks very much, and yeah, great presentation, and we're obviously really interested in this work that the team have done because we are currently developing socio-economic impact guidance for offshore renewable energy. So that reflects just the general level of importance to make sure that in particular the social impacts are better covered. So both Kathleen and I are social scientists. So this is our sort of bread and butter really, and we're sort of very aware of the need to draw out the requirements on the social side of things. So I think the guidance, in the process of developing that, we are also intending to do some kind of interactive consultation with developers and other stakeholders who will be wanting to use this guidance or who are experts in this field. So we will be I think through that medium, it will be to draw in their views on the guidance and the processes that we're going to be recommending that they take to do better sort of social and economic impact assessments. So I think that'll be one way of sort of raising the profile of this research and the findings from it. And we're obviously delighted to see these outputs from John's team, because we will be drawing heavily on them, because obviously there is a guidance document there already. So that's going to save us a lot of work, but we will be drawing on that and some other important pieces to put together the guidance document that's be more specifically for offshore renewables in Scotland. So that's sort of the guidance aspect of that. We've also got the ScotMer research programme. So I'm the chair of the socio-economic group, and we've been sort of harnessing energy within that group at the moment around both developing the guidance and the work around the evidence map that the ScotMer programme is. They have evidence maps across all the receptor groups. So the socio-economic one is in need of a lot of work at the moment. So both Kathleen and I are looking at that and working with all the partners who are on the group to identify what we think needs to be done to meet those evidence gaps. So that sort of turns to that question around the monitoring project that John was suggesting we could do. So we have already been given some consideration to what further research we would like to do, and something along those lines in terms of monitoring how offshore projects are impacting on coastal communities around Scotland and in fact wider the UK, so that we can start to build that evidence base over a longer time period. So we're looking at what we can do, and we'd want to do that in a collaborative way through the ScotMer programme and the partners on that. And we need to sort of set out what the project would ideally look like, and then where we're going to get funding in order to deliver that project. So it's still at an early stage of thinking, but with a lot of a bit more time and resource being put into this from our perspective. So that's where we are. I don't know, Kathleen may want to say a little bit more about the guidance that we're working on, and also anything else about ScotMer that I've not got to say. So I'll hand over to Kathleen.
Hi everyone. Hi. Kay, I actually think you did a really good job of covering everything that we're working on. Yeah, with the guidance, I suppose, just to kind of reiterate a lot of the things that John mentioned, I suppose a big part of what we found is like the importance of engaging with local communities and trying to think about how to do that best. And yeah, again, also kind of focusing on this monitoring aspect, making sure that impacts are monitored throughout the life cycle of the project. I suppose also just to say, as part of the guidance, we're producing a sort of, I don't know whether to call it a handbook or a toolkit, but basically pulling together methods that are like good methods to use for each of these stages, I suppose, just to help developers, but also those assessing impact assessments, to kind of understand whether the appropriate methods are being used and how they work and that sort of thing. So that would be methods for engaging with local communities, for predicting impacts, for monitoring, and also some kind of best practice guidance for the community benefit analysis. So we're hoping that kind of, that will help developers and assessors alike to kind of think of the sort of the tools they should be using. So I think I can't think of anything else to add, because I think you did a fairly comprehensive job there, Kay. So, but if anyone has any more questions, then yeah, obviously we'll both be happy to answer. Oh, and thanks for the presentation, John. It was really interesting as well.
Yeah,
Can I just take up one point that Kay and Kathleen have raised, which is getting this guidance out to practice and to developers and to consultancies, because they're the ones we need to influence in particular. And what we've done on previous studies is because we can't present at conferences or live working groups, we have been doing webinars like this to consultancies and to developers, and I hope maybe we can do something like that for this project as well, to actually get it out there to current practitioners.
Okay, there's one last question because we're nearly at 11 o'clock now. George Lee, did you want to ask your question, or did you want to take it off a separate question?
No, I'd be keen to ask, if I may. It should be quite quick. Like everyone else, John, thank you very much. I thoroughly enjoyed that. I found it incredibly interesting. I was particularly interested to see how the attitudes changed in Aberdeen from pre-app through to development and build out of the scheme there, and how attitudes generally the trends seem to be very positive, going through that sort of life cycle. I didn't pick up, were there any trends which went the other way? Were there any issues where generally there was an increasingly negative perception through the life cycle, or was it all positive?
Bridget,
one for you.
Yeah, I was. Well, there's two aspects of this, as you say, the social or qualitative side. There's the actual impacts on the immediate community where it comes to land, where the cable comes to land, and their sort of concerns about what the impact was going to be, which is typical in any sort of construction project where people have been affected by the construction phase. So their attitude sort of continued all the way through the construction phase, but once everything's in the ground and you can't see it, then it changes. The other one was when the turbines start to appear from actually in the sea. There's a lot of the sort of fear of the unknown to start with. We're not sure what it's going to look like, how big it's going to be. So there was a lot of, and then you start to get to people's attitudes. Okay, now we've got used to it being there, but there's a lot of people become conflicted, saying, I don't particularly like it there, but I understand why we need it, renewable energy, etc. And then a very small number that then do become affected negatively about it. So in some ways it mirrors that German study, almost, in terms of how the range of people and people's feelings. So there's a lot of human elements, but no, it did tend to be, okay, it's there now, we are used to it. So that is how, it's that, to some extent, the fear of the unknown. Didn't know how big it was going to be and how close to shore it was going to be, regardless of how much information you can provide. And the efforts that the community liaison officer did with developing the little avatars and this to scale wind farm in I think it was on the science museums, which is really a clever idea, but still doesn't always get out there to a number of people how big they're actually going to be. But it did seem to be, there was that sort of shift to, yes, it's there now.
Yeah. I mean, for me, I find that particularly reassuring given how close those wind turbines are to the shore compared to most any other wind farm that's going to be built. So.
There are some off the English coast which are equally as close. There's the one down at off the Brighton coast, with the Rampion, I think it is. So that's quite close to the shore as well. And the boat trips going out there are increasingly popular. That is one of the positive tourism impacts. Additional draw to the area.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. I mean, this is something we're doing more research on, actually, to look at the tourism impacts. I think the focus has been on the negative impacts, but where they are close to shore, there are also some positive opportunities as well in terms of people just viewing from car parks, maybe opportunities for visitor centres, boat trips as well. So there are pluses and minuses in terms of tourism impacts.
Okay, so that was all the questions. One from Emily saying, can she have a copy of the report? Well, as you say, it will be publicly available. We'll deposit in our university repository, and it will have a digital occupier identifier, digital object identifier, so anybody will be able to circulate around and you'll always be able to find it.
Yep. I can send it around as well.
Okay. Thanks, Robin.
Yeah, Emily had missed off the list somehow.
Okay. Robin, is there anything you want to say to round up? I think it's 11:05 now.
Yeah, well, I think we had to 11:30 originally, didn't we, in the agenda?
Yeah, we had more time.
Oh, sorry. Oh, well, more questions then.
So if there are any more questions, then please shout. Otherwise, I think everyone has my email contact. So if you think of anything after the fact, then please do get in touch. And as has been mentioned, we will be pushing the reports on our website, on the Vattenfall website. There's a EOWDC page on that website where we have been publishing the interim reports as the projects have gone along, and we'll be putting them on there in the very near future. So yeah, thank you very much, John and Bridget, for hosting, and thank you everyone for attending. And if there's no more questions, then we can wrap it up there.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yes, thanks all for attending.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.